Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 27th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep this show going is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. Just like that kind of standard NPR and PBS model, those of you who are interested in making a per episode donation can do so by visiting patreon.com/Talk Nerdy. You make it so that everybody can listen. We don't watch, we listen, that everybody can listen 100% for free. And that's because of the incredible help from people just like you. So this week, I want to thank my top patrons. They include Anu Baravaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. All right, let's get into it. So this is kind of a different one this week. I had the opportunity to speak with author Amanda Montell, but I did it in a different setting than usual. I was lucky enough to interview her for a virtual event that was recorded live with the Toronto Public Library. So what you're hearing now is that event. We made a deal to be able to play it right here on the show, which is really, really wonderful. So I want to thank the Toronto Public Library for that opportunity. So Amanda Montell is a New York Times bestselling author. She wrote the previous books Cultish and Word Slut. She also has a podcast called Sounds Like a Cult, and she studied linguistics in school. Her newest book is called The Age of Magical Overthinking: Notes on Modern Irrationality. So without any further ado, here she is, Amanda Montell. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation with you, Amanda. And I thought maybe to get started, you could share an excerpt from your book that maybe tells us a little bit about why you wrote it and what your sort of personal kind of investment was in it.
Happily. Yeah, I'm going to read for like 5 minutes from the intro of the book, which is called Make It Make Sense, an Intro to Magical Overthinking. And I want to preface by saying that my cat, Claire, is in the room with us, and she has a lot of thoughts on this subject matter. She's not very well decorated degree-wise, but her hot takes are steaming, very spicy. Okay, here we go. The attempts I made to get out of my own head were sundry and full of nonsense. I visited a petting zoo for adults. I tried learning to meditate from a British computer voice. I stocked up on an unregulated nutrition powder called brain dust. My brain felt like dust. In the last few years, dread for no reason became one of my most frequent Google searches, as if the act of typing my feelings to a robot would make them go away. I gorged myself on podcasts about women who'd snapped, at once repulsed and tantalized by those who wore their madness on their sleeves. How good it must feel to snap, I thought. My most cinematic attempt at mental rehab involved picking herbs on a farm in Sicily under a light pollution-free sky. At night here, the stars are so close they could fall into your mouth, the herb farmer told me, sending my heart to my throat. With varying degrees of success, I was doing everything I could think of to defect from the state of overwhelm and consumption that had become my life in the roaring 2020s. Anything to gain some perspective on the mental health exigency I'd been experiencing and trying to rationalize for the better part of a decade. Every generation has its own brand of crisis. Those of the 1960s and 70s were about gaining freedom from physical tyrannies, equal rights and opportunities to vote, learn, work, mobilize. They were crises of the body. But as the century turned, so did our struggles inward. Paradoxically, the more collective progress we made, the more individual malaise we felt. Discourse about our mental unwellness crescendoed. In 2017, Scientific American declared that the nation's mental health had declined since the 1990s and that suicide rates were at a 30-year high. 4 years later, a CDC survey found that 42% of young people felt so sad or hopeless in the last 2 weeks that they couldn't go about their normal days. The National Alliance on Mental Illness reported that between 2020 and 2021, crisis calls to their lifeline were up 251%. We're living in what they call the information age, but life only seems to be making less sense. We're isolated, listless, burnt out on screens, cutting loved ones out like tumors in the spirit of boundaries, failing to understand other people's choices or even our own. The machine is malfunctioning, and we're trying to think our way out of it. In 1961, Marxist philosopher Franz Fanon wrote, "Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it." Our mission, it seems, has to do with the mind. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Broadly, magical thinking describes the belief that one's internal thoughts can affect external events. One of my first exposures to the concept came from Joan Didion's memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking, which vivifies grief's power to make even the most self-aware minds deceive themselves. Mythologizing the world as an attempt to make sense of it is a unique and curious human habit. In moments of fierce uncertainty, from the sudden death of a spouse to a high-stakes election season, otherwise reasonable brains start to buckle. There she goes. All right, Claire. Thanks for joining. She's bored. All right. Whether it's the conviction that one can manifest their way out of financial hardship, thwart the apocalypse by learning to can their own peaches, stave off cancer with positive vibes, or transform an abusive relationship to a glorious one with hope alone, magical thinking works in service of restoring agency. While magical thinking is an age-old quirk, overthinking feels distinct to the modern era, a product of our innate superstitions clashing with information overload, mass loneliness, and a capitalistic pressure to know everything under the sun. In 2014, Bell Hooks said, "The most basic activism we can have in our lives is to live consciously in a nation living in fantasies. You will face reality. You will not delude yourself." To become as aware as we can of the mind's natural distortions, to see both the beauty and utter folly in them. This, I believe, ought to be part of our era's shared mission. We can let the cognitive dissonance bring us to our knees, or we can board the dizzying swing between logos and pathos. We can strap in for a lifelong ride. Learning to stomach a sense of irresolution might be the only way to survive this crisis. That's precisely what this exploration of cognitive biases has helped me do. Even more than Sicilian stargazing, writing this book has been the one thing that's kept the buzz in my head at a decibel level I can stand. The Zen Buddhists have a word, koan, which means unsolvable riddle. You break the mind in order to reveal deeper truths and reassemble the pieces to create something new. I wrote this book as a yearning, a Rorschach test, a PSA, and a love letter to the mind. It's not a system of thought, but rather something more like a koan. If you have all but lost faith in others' ability to reason, or have made a cornucopia of questionable judgments that you can't even explain, my hope is for these chapters to make some sense of the senseless, to crack open a window in our minds and let a warm breeze in, to help quiet the cacophony for a while, or even hear a melody in it. Thank you.
Thank you. So, something really comes up for me at the beginning, and that is, I think about my experience kind of dedicating my life and my professional career to scientific skepticism, critical thinking, neuropsychological humility through both my sort of public science communication work, but also as a psychologist. As you sat down to write this, how did you sort of put yourself on that dialectic? Were you somebody who was like pretty credulous, who was like, I believe anything everyone tells me? Or were you already something of a skeptic?
I'm probably the worst of both, So, I mean, I guess a little bit of context is that I grew up the daughter of scientists. My dad is a neuroscientist. My mom is a cancer cell biologist. And so like our religious text was, the dictionary, like books by Darwin. We like had a shrine to like a theory of everything in our home. Like we literally Merriam-Webster's dictionary was on a pedestal in my living room growing up. That was so reverent that I remember a friend in middle school entering our house and being like, "Is this the Torah or the Bible?" And I was like, "Babe, it's the dictionary." Um, so yeah, I mean, my parents definitely instilled in me sort of a disdain for mysticism, and a real respect for scientific inquiry and skepticism. And yet I was the sort of like theatrical, melodramatic one of the family who loved theater and ritual and pomp and circumstance. And so like squaring those two drives was always kind of difficult for me and made me feel like somewhat of a black sheep. But I think of myself as someone who is deeply skeptical, but that can border on like smug. Like I went into writing my last book, which is about the language of cults from Scientology to Soul Cycle. So this wide spectrum of cult like groups. I went in thinking, like I think many of us probably do when we watch cult documentaries or start, investigating cults in various ways. I was thinking like, I would never join a group like this, like I am a true skeptic. Like no one could ever, convince me of these like totally ridiculous ideologies. And then, of course, as I started looking more into it, I was like, actually, wow, like a lot of these techniques of influence have really shown up in my life, maybe not in the canonical cult context, but in one-on-one dynamics that grow to resemble cults and things like that. And I had a similar, well, same, but different sort of approach to this book where I was thinking like, I am so so audacious to think that like I could possibly get a hold of my cognitive biases by just like learning more about them. And instead, it's sort of just this whole investigation of cognitive biases and, how that relates to this phrase that I'm coining, magical overthinking, has really been an exercise in humility, and an embrace of my own irrational tendencies that are really like universal and incredibly human, and just trying to really notice where my mysticisms are serving me and where they're not serving me, and to extend that compassion toward others as well.
Absolutely. And that really makes me think of two things. So I want to put a pin in the cognitive bias conversation because that's the next thing I want to get to. But first, that phrase, magical overthinking. So sort of in that excerpt, you mentioned, magical thinking. We kind of know what we mean when we say that. Maybe it's things that are supernatural or things that are like pseudo religious or spiritual, things outside of the natural, testable scientific realm. But overthinking, this is a modern and kind of new approach. So combining the two, help us understand a little bit better. What is magical overthinking?
Yeah, well, I really conceive of it as this clash between our resource rationality. The ways that we make decisions in everyday life are really predicated on our limited time, limited memory storage, limited cognitive resources in various ways. And that throughout human history has caused us to conclude a lot of things, to infuse a sort of like cosmic logic into events that don't make other kinds of sense to us. And that's a coping mechanism, and it's very human, and it has for a long time not been all that much of a problem. We've always used, cognitive biases and our imperfect decision-making strategies, and at times, really superstitious magical thinking as a way to make sense of the world enough to survive it. But my argument is that the problems that we are now tasked with contending with every single day are simply more abstract and complex and disembodied than the problems our brains develop to handle. And that is what's causing so much of the overthinking that we're experiencing. I have found that this idea of like thought spiraling and, overthinking and underthinking all the wrong things, like spiraling out at night over some, Instagram comment that you like can't parse out exactly what it means, but then jumping to conclusions about some subject matter that you truly know nothing about, but you're like, oh yes, I feel very confident in my, conclusions about that. That is like such an interesting phenomenon. Like, why are we not like poring over these more complex ideas? We're instead like up at night thinking about like some dumb thing we said 3 years ago at a party. So I really find that, our cognitive biases, our innate decision-making strategies are just like clashing with modern society. And that collision is what I'm referencing as magical overthinking.
Makes sense. And I think it's so, relevant for where we are all today, completely social media addicted, completely, doom scrolling every single night of our lives. And so I'm curious, one of the things that you talk about quite a bit in the book is this concept of cognitive biases, right? These things that we all fall victim to. These are just kind of like evolved ways of thinking that help us make sense of the world. I have long thought that, I don't know, like confirmation bias is kind of the mother of all cognitive biases. Like it subsumes quite a few of them. But I'm
Yeah.
curious which ones you chose to focus on the book and why.
Yeah. Yeah. So the sort of like lens or motif of the book, my like way into exploring this really massive idea of magical overthinking was through cognitive biases. This is a term coined by the late behavioral economists and real life besties, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman just passed away 3 weeks ago, which was like, so it felt magical, I immediately like projected some superstitiousness onto that. Okay.
Coincidence? Yes.
Coincidence? Yes.
Yes.
The way that the human mind tends to misattribute cause and effect would lead me to think otherwise. Anyway, yeah. But anywho, I remember coming across an infographic that laid out like 200 plus of the cognitive biases that have been described over the years. And selecting the 11 that I use as sort of themes for each of the chapters in the book was a pretty intuitive process. I mean, all on their own, these different cognitive biases aren't difficult to understand, actually. Like you can pretty easily absorb like an academic paper about confirmation bias or zero sum bias. And I think that's really cool. These papers are not necessarily like the most accessible in the entire world, but it's not like jumping right into a physics paper, like it actually, concepts are not that difficult to understand if you dig in. But I basically I read a bunch of papers and it became clear to me intuitively which ones felt the most urgent, relevant to the larger zeitgeist. I could immediately, upon reading about the halo effect, see how it applied to the cycles of celebrity worship and dethronement that we see in our society. I could immediately see how reading a few papers on proportionality bias could explain the like mass embrace of Instagram manifestation gurus that I was noticing in my community. And so that was like a really intuitive process, but it was also nice to have the constraint of cognitive biases to know where to go in the book, because otherwise I think this subject could have been really unwieldy.
What about the phenomenon that occurs when somebody who's putting in a lot of work to know thy biases, this idea of neuropsychological humility, sort of, I know I'm going to fall victim to these things. This is a very human experience. So trying to understand myself better may make me a little bit more aware and therefore a little less likely. Yet something kind of happens when you start to operate in this way, that you see them all around you. And I'm curious, how have you navigated the social component of being aware of cognitive biases? When do you say something? When do you not? When do you not want to be that person who steps in? What's that been like for you, having put so much effort into this work?
I'm totally that person with like my close friends and family. I think it would not play well to like be in some kind of debate or argument with someone that you don't know particularly well, not like I'm constantly arguing with people that I know particularly well, but if I'm engaging in some exchange of ideas with someone and me like noticing that a particular cognitive bias, whether it's like survivorship bias or whatever it is, and like clocking that in the moment, you just like
Right.
look like a know-it-all. I would not know. I would not endorse that. But something that I learned while researching the book that at first seemed disheartening, but now I feel like is a hopeful sentiment, is that we're pretty bad at changing other people's minds with facts. Like, it's not effective, this, but we're pretty okay at changing our own minds and like reframing things for ourselves. So, as I move through the world, behaviors in other people or in myself that would otherwise seem so confounding to me that I might write them off or myself off as like maybe fundamentally evil or like a ding dong, like just someone who doesn't make sense and whose behavior like has no rationale and thus like they're a bad person or I'm a bad person. I'm now able to sort of identify the motivational factors, not really as an excuse, but as an explanation. And that helps me forgive myself. It helps me forgive other people instead of just like writing off us all as these like hopeless nincompoops. And so that's been really healing.
It's also really indicative of a sort of growth as opposed to a fixed mindset, and somebody who believes or endorses things like rehabilitation. There's a very kind of classic study where psychologists asked people, do you believe in evil? Like the concept of pure evil. And those who tended to believe in pure evil were less likely to endorse things like rehabilitation in prisons. And they were more likely to endorse just long sentences and keeping people out of the public sphere. And so it's interesting that there is that correlation between if you can attribute somebody's actions to their previous experiences, their life, lots of circumstances, you're going to be more flexible in your thinking and believe that people can change and grow and learn new things, which I think is an important component of, being aware of your magical overthinking.
Yeah.
So I want to turn to the Q&A, and just to remind everybody who's watching right now, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A because I'm going to be pulling from that throughout the hour. So we've got one here from Rajiv Gupta who said, I'm wondering if this book or its content was more relevant for women as the author began to write it. I would imagine that overthinking would cripple all indiscriminately. No, but that does raise an interesting question about sort of, is there a gender component to your approach to this book? And was there any crossover with sort of modern feminism or conversations about the patriarchy at all?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, I have a biased lens, of course, and so I'm going to be attracted toward scenarios that feel applicable to me. So, yeah, there are gender dynamics discussed in this book that are from a more feminist perspective. There's a chapter in the book called The Shit Talking Hypothesis, and that addresses a cognitive bias called zero-sum bias, which some might recognize our tendency to think that another person's gain inherently means your loss, which isn't always true and is almost never true when applied to sort of abstract modern currencies like success or beauty or clout, but was once very much applicable to stiff competition with limited resources like mates and food many millennia ago. And because of my lens and my personal interests and who I am, I wanted to explore zero-sum bias in the context of social comparison. And, women are found to make more upward social comparisons and downward identifications, meaning like when they survey, all of the people that they follow on their Instagram feed or a room full of people, they will tend to compare themselves only to the people that they perceive as superior. Not naturally, this is a result of conditioning, but that was so interesting and felt like really applicable to my own life and healing to learn about. But another person writing The Age of Magical Overthinking with a different background and a different gender identity, I'm sure would have chosen different subject matter. But in fact, most but I'm not a behavioral economist. I'm using these cognitive biases as a motif. But formal behavioral economics books written by PhDs, which are fascinating and which I cite throughout this book, usually are written by men. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like there's a lot out there on how this stuff applies to to those who've been socialized male. And I thought it would be fun to sort of apply them in a more intimate context. Sometimes a more girly context, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. And I'm curious, because you were sort of talking about your own personal experience and learning these things and writing the book and how much you related to this zero sum bias. Are there any other biases that you came across or that you did a deep dive on that you were like, that's me. I do that all the time. I need to work on this?
Oh, well, like all of them, I mean, there's one that I touch on briefly in my chapter on the sunk cost fallacy, which is our proclivity to think that resources already spent on an endeavor, money, time, but also emotional resources like hope or secrets, justify spending even more. There's a study that I quote in that chapter that has to do with additive versus subtractive solution bias. So we as human beings, quite naturally, but especially those of us who grow up in consumerist societies, when faced with a problem, our tendency is to want to add a whole bunch of variables to the equation as an attempt for a solution, when oftentimes the much more efficient but less intuitive solution to the problem would be to take something away. So the studies that I cite pertain to inviting participants to solve a problem involving, colored blocks. It was like a spatial puzzle by either adding or subtracting colored blocks. And the vast majority of people opted for the much more cumbersome additive solution of, putting more colored blocks onto the assortment. Very few people decided on the subtractive solution, which was much quicker and more efficient, which was just to take one single block away to solve the problem. And this was mind-blowing to me because it has applied to so many arenas of my life. In that chapter, I talk about a one-on-one sort of cult-like relationship that I justified as a victim of the sunk cost fallacy to myself for years and years and years. Every time the relationship got especially bad, I would dig my heels in. I would justify my efforts. And this additive versus subtractive solution bias stuff was really interesting because it made me reflect and realize, oh yeah, like during our most painful moments in that relationship, I thought, we'll fix this problem. Not breaking up. No. That never even occurred to me. I was like, we should go on another vacation, or we should replace all our furniture. Like it was this very
Let's have a kid.
Yeah, thank God. Oh my God, thank God. I have a whole bunch of cats though. I was like, cats will solve it. I regret none of my cats. But so that's a high stakes example. A lower stakes example might be, this is a real example from my life. I was looking at my junk drawer in my house the other week and it was such a mess. I was like, you know what I need to do? I need to go to the Container Store and get some like really aesthetic acrylic drawer organizers. Like that'll solve my junk drawer problem. It's like, just throw things away, So becoming aware of biases like that has actually had like a real serviceable effect on my life. That's one that really comes to mind.
It's really interesting as you're kind of sharing this with us because I am I'll admit it, I love a good poker game. And so many of these things have allegories in poker. You can almost see the microcosm at the table and then the macrocosm in real life. And so it makes me curious, are you a gamer at all? Do you play poker?
I play poker with my family. Yeah, Texas Hold'em. Yeah, I really try not to. I'm not a gambler. I really try not to fall victim to sunk cost fallacy when playing poker. Like, I will fold so fast, maybe too fast. My skill in poker, I would say, is probably reading. This is not a skill. Poker is fun for me because I love how bad my dad's poker face is, and I'm highly.
So you're very good at reading your father specifically at the poker table.
It's like Karen in Mean Girls when she's like, my boobs can tell when it's about to rain. Actually, they can tell when it's raining. That's me. Sorry, I shouldn't say the word boobs and my dad in the same sentence. Quickly move on.
We'll continue on.
Thank you.
So there's There's an interesting question here in the chat from, I think it's Wine Sang. I could be pronouncing that wrong. And it says, could the fashion of political promises or lies set the example for the mass to follow with magical thinking? And maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I would add to that or to make it more of a compound question. And obviously, this is an event for the Toronto Public Library. We're here in Los Angeles. So the political sort of spectrum is a little bit different that we're operating under. But I often think about the executive branch specifically, but I think this applies to all of, well, other than for us, the judiciary, but the executive and the legislative. It's all about sort of making a promise to get elected. Got to get that promise out, got to get elected. It's all very short-term thinking, as opposed to, that cycle is almost inducing, in my mind, the need for a lot of cognitive biases. So I'm curious if you've really grappled with the relationship between like our political spectrum and how these cognitive biases play into the masses.
Definitely. I mean, politics and the political landscape are a flavor throughout the book. Obviously, you cannot discuss confirmation bias without addressing politics. I address the Supreme Court in that chapter. But the one that really springs to mind, and it springs to my mind in particular because of my background in linguistics, is this cognitive bias that I address in the book called the illusory truth effect, which is very simple but fascinating. It describes our like truly irresistible penchant to believe something is true just because we've heard it multiple times. I'm writing an essay for The Guardian right now about how this shows up in political discourse. It's such a deceptively simple idea that like repetition could make you think something is true even when it's not, but it's actually so profound and shocking how like even studies by social scientists like Lisa Fazio have proven that even if you know something is implausible, like fish breathe water or like Mars is the biggest planet in the solar system, if study participants hear a phrase like that enough in the course of a study, they will start to internalize it as true. And so again, human beings are only resource rational. We have a lot of cognitive limits. We have temporal limits, etc. And so we're doing our best with the information given to us. But now in 21st century America, and as our society becomes ever more complex, these decision-making strategies just like aren't good enough. It's like repetition is no longer the best clue that something is true in the era of disinformation and misinformation spread. And so I was speaking to some scholars just this week for this Guardian piece. I was like, how can we resist the illusory truth effect? They were like, oh, we really can't. Like, an awareness of it is not helpful for this one in particular. But they were like, you know what we can do? We can harness what disinformers are so good at, and we can use that to spread real facts. So
right, like use that for public health messaging.
Yes, like we know that repetition is extremely effective. It's not annoying to remind people of true facts, even if they already know. We need those reminders. We know that rhyme helps people. We know that like rhetorical strategies like rhyme and like easy to read fonts and easily recognizable rhetorical patterns, we know that those things help with processing fluency, make us feel like things are more accurate. So use them to spread real facts, like constantly spout just things that are true. Like, we won't tire of it.
So, it makes me wonder a little bit about the different flavors or the different severities of magical overthinking. Very often we have people in our lives, we ourselves fall victim to pseudoscience that is really believable because there's always a bit of a kernel of truth in it. It's a slight twist of the rational evidence to support an agenda. And then you have what we often consider like the tinfoil hat style beliefs like flat earthism or even maybe something like anti-vaxxerism. And it's sort of easy to put them on a continuum, but these cognitive biases really contribute to all of this type of magical thinking, don't they? Do you see a difference in how you get from like here all the way over to there?
Oh, well, yeah, definitely. I mean, algorithmically, you could like start by following a sort of like maybe slightly woo-woo holistic mental health influencer online, let's say. And then the more you engage with their like most absolutist nuggets of wisdom, you can start to tread into conspiratorial thinking. I have seen that happen. The whole like conspirituality movement is growing and becoming such a problem for this very reason. Conspirituality is a fantastic word. For those who don't know it, I didn't coin it. It was coined in 2011 in an academic paper, but it's a combination of the terms conspiracy theory and spirituality, and it defines this like emergent, well, really like skyrocketing movement of believers who subscribe to two core tenets, one being that we are on the brink of a paradigm shift in consciousness, and the other that there is an evil elite secretly controlling the socio-political order. And there are like some mainstream appealing aspects to questioning the status quo, and not just believing at face value everything that the government says and things like that, or taking a more taking your mental health treatment into your own hands, having skepticism of the medical authority, things like that. But there is a point past which it can go too far, and when you start going too far, that is when sort of pernicious, conspiratorial gurus who are more accessible than ever, who online are able to spread rhetoric more easily than ever, can then take advantage of those people who didn't start out that extreme, but because of the ways that algorithms work and the ways that everybody has access to them, can definitely escalate. And I don't want to be like alarmist about it. It's not like everybody who engages with like a holistic life coach on Instagram will like fall into QAnon territory, but their rhetoric overlaps enough. And we know, because of the excess of information and the ways that our brains process information, that that we can be taken advantage of, such that that transition from believing something that maybe is a little bit delulu, so to speak, but not that harmful, falling off the deep end into the more QAnon stuff, that is happening more and more.
And it's kind of hard to position that line in the sand, that threshold, right? Because we can talk about that's harmless, but that over there is harmful. But there's so many different ways to define that. It could be harmful for mental health. It could be economically harmful. It could be sociopolitically harmful. And sometimes it's harmful before you realize it's harmful. And
That's
then the
so
hooks are in.
true. Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because there's a chapter in the book called "I Swear I Manifested This," and this is the one in which I argue that hardcore conspiracy theories and these seemingly innocent ideas of manifestation are powered by the same cognitive bias, this proportionality bias, the tendency to believe that big events or even just big feelings must have had a big cause. It's the only way that makes proportional sense. And you can attribute this to conspiracy theories like the government must have engineered COVID, or these seemingly innocuous ideas like my vision board is the reason why I have an amazing new job. And sometimes people will feel a little bit like threatened by this suggestion that manifestation is conspiratorial in any way. But I also make the argument that, like, look, a lot of human beings most of us, I would say, are naturally conspiratorial in some aspect. Anyone who's ever made a gross misattribution of cause and effect, or like projected intentionality into something where there really was none, has a pinch of conspiracy theorist in them. I don't know how many people can relate to, your phone not working and you being like, why are you doing this to me? It's like that's not, your phone conspiring against you.
Right.
We often feel like kind of paranoid that way. And that paranoia can really blow up and be exploited more quickly than ever, I would say, en masse in today's society. But yeah, like, yes, you're completely right. Like manifestation, ideas of manifestation, like for some people, they're really good and they're not that harmful. But for some people, they actually are harmful before you even realize it, before you're in like the QAnon Reddit forum.
Yeah. And I think an example that comes to mind for me just out of my own practice. So I'm a psychologist and I work very often with people who are quite ill, specifically with people who have cancer. And I specialize in working through the end of life. And so often the most pernicious thing that I come up against is the antithesis of, well, I thought good thoughts, and so that was going to keep me alive. Well, then, keep going with this analogy, that means then if you get sicker and sicker and sicker, you tend to blame yourself like you weren't thinking positively enough when that has nothing to do with how cancer destroys body tissue. And I think that, and it's such a hard thing to work on undoing those beliefs. There's so much guilt and shame when I'm working with these patients.
That makes a ton of sense. And yeah, it reminds me of like the Mukherjee quote. He's the author of The Emperor of All Maladies and Song of the Cell, where he says, positive thinking surely will not hurt as you navigate an illness like cancer, but positive thinking does not cure cancer just the way that negative thinking doesn't cause it. And yet, like, practicing optimism is a worthwhile endeavor, no matter what the causes and effects are, because thinking positively, if you can manage it, engaging in an optimism practice just feels good. It might not lead to like an outcome other than feeling a little better along the way, and yet it's still worth engaging in. And yet, yeah, we don't like things to happen at random. Like we want to believe that there's agency. It's the same reason why like a little kid will blame themselves for their parents' divorce. It's because like accepting that bad things happen way outside of your control makes the universe feel chaotic, and believing that you caused something negative to happen at least means that the world isn't that chaotic. But yeah, accepting that sort of thing is, I still struggle with it. I want there to be some astral rationale for everything that I do. I want the seeds that I plant in life to bloom into flowers later, and sometimes life doesn't work out that way. I narrativize the living daylights out of my life. I always want to tell myself that like my life is a movie and there are plot points, and I'm like planting a seed here and that's going to be fruitful later, and life isn't always like that, and I will always be on a journey to accepting that.
Yeah, I mean, we all want things to feel just, and even in a cosmic sense, we want there to be justice. And that's, I think, one of the hardest lessons in life to learn is that we sit with ambivalence, and sometimes we don't have control, and what do we do when we're in that moment instead of grasping for control? One thing came up for me when we were talking about individuals who believe in pseudoscience or who tend to engage in magical overthinking. And I wanted to know how you parse or how you grapple with the distinction between the sort of practitioners of woo and the receivers of woo. Do you see them as the same? Because I think we can tend to sometimes blame the victims, when I personally believe that there's a big difference between somebody who has like a monetary or socio-political agenda versus somebody who is just reading this stuff and internalizing it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we both live in Los Angeles, where there is a lot of sort of metaphysical, magical overthinking practices happening. And from time to time, for fun or for anthropology, I will engage in some of that, because it feels good. It can be a community practice to engage in a ritual that doesn't make logical sense or that won't actually cause something to happen differently later on. Some of my wisest, most educated friends really indulge in tarot and astrology, and I think it's a piece of culture here. Like, astrology in some of my communities serve the role of like sports discourse in others. It's fodder for conversation. It's a framework for trying to understand certain phases of your life or your personality. And I think like to an extent, and with that twinkle in your eye, engaging in that sort of talk is not harmful, or reading horoscopes or whatever. Like I think it can all be in good fun. And yeah, absolutely, I do believe that there are people who are taking a dogmatic approach to those subjects and charging $35 a month for their bespoke manifestation technique. And if it doesn't work on you, well, that's your fault. And there's so much of that really exploded, in particular during the pandemic, when we were all grasping for agency and answers. And there were more than a few manifestation TikTokers who were like, I'm pivoting. It was almost in like an MLM style, like a multi-level marketing pyramid scheme style, like harnessing that widespread fear and uncertainty to, rebrand.
Yeah. I think about sort of your mention of astrology is a great example of this like community engagement that is almost in some ways like a secular religion. And just like religion, it can offer so much benefit to individuals' lives until it doesn't or unless it doesn't, and just like in religion, some of the leaders and practitioners can be very moral and very just, and some of them can utilize that power in a way that is really immoral and really unjust. And so it really does seem like the metric here is harm once again, but that's a really hard thing to pin down.
Definitely, especially when the harm is so cerebral, and that is so much of what I was trying to confront in this book is like I feel okay. Like I feel in terms of like my physical body to my knowledge, like I'm okay right now. And yet why do I wake up in fight or flight every day? Like what is going on? And I think that the onslaught of identities that we're forced to compare ourselves to every single day, the news that we have a civic responsibility to consume but are also sort of exploited to consume by media companies and fear-mongering clickbaiters and such. There is just this tension going on between our digitally motivated culture, our capitalistically motivated culture, and the way that our minds are able to manage information.
Absolutely. So we've got a new question from Florence McCambridge. This is a great one. She says, I loved Cultish, and I cannot wait to read your take on overthinking. I'm just curious how you decide what to write about and how you know whether something is a book or more of an essay or an opinion piece.
Oh, great question. Let's see. Well, it's not like I'm constantly like inspired by a million book ideas. I do know people who are like that, who are like hyper creative, who are, every single day they're like, oh, this could be a book, this could be a book, this could be a book. I got like one decent book idea every 3 years. You know what I mean? Like I am not plagued by the muse. The muse finds me like, you know, just as much as I really need her. And I would say that my book ideas tend to stem from the project that I'm currently working on. So my first book was about language and gender, this sort of quick and dirty crash course in feminist sociolinguistics called Word Slut. And that book really inspired me to take an even deeper interest in language and power and the relationship between the two. That interest naturally led me to want to write about cults and the language of cults, also because my dad grew up in one against his will. And so I felt like a personal connection to that. And then it was during my research for Cultish that I really started reading about cognitive biases in a formal way for the first time. And not only could they explain so many of the cult mechanics that I was looking into, but my own daily behaviors and so many of the confounding behaviors that I was noticing in others as well. And so I thought it would be cool to write essentially like an essay collection where every chapter is dedicated to a different cognitive bias. And then but I do want to write fiction next. And I will say that and the novel idea that I'm currently outlining was also sort of inspired by a little bit of this book and a little bit of what I've written before. Obviously in a completely different genre because it's narrative and I get to make up stories, but that's something that I've been craving also, is just like leaning more into narrative writing. And how do I know if something is a book rather than just like a sort of one-off article? Oh, that's a great question. Certainly if something does not feel evergreen, if a subject matter feels like it has a timely like urgency, like it's only gonna have a week-long shelf life or like a year-long shelf life, that's probably better suited to a one-off article or a podcast episode. But these are questions that I ask myself, like every time I set out to write a new project. I always ask myself, like, why me? Like, why am I the right person to write this piece? Why does it need to be in this medium, a book versus a podcast episode or something else? And why now? Like, why is this a message that people need to hear now? And will it be a message that people need to hear in 10 years? And if the answer is yes, then maybe that's more of a book project. Sorry, it was a
Yeah,
unrelated answer, but
it's such a beautiful kind of component of curiosity and of like utilizing the scientific method that as we dig into a question, more questions come. And so hearing that like kind of each book opened up a new world and built upon itself is fascinating. And I'm curious, do you ever, sort of along that same line, do you ever write an essay that then grows and grows and grows and becomes like a full-length book? Did any of these start as earlier seeds, like you did a podcast episode or an essay, and then it sort of got bigger and bigger?
yeah. Well, I'll say this, this is me really revealing something that I wouldn't ordinarily talk about, but my first book, the concept for that book was really based on this like very cringe-tastic series of short YouTube videos that I was making when I was like 23. Um, I was making these like fun poppy videos about language, gender, and pop culture. And I didn't really know why I was doing it other than that I was trying to sort of find my perspective and my tone as a maker of things. And I would not have necessarily predicted that that little YouTube series would end up being the sort of proof of concept for my first book. But that's why it's you don't always have to have a project like fully and perfectly fleshed out in your head to just kind of like start making the thing. I think, like what is it? Perfection is the enemy of good. Like, you just kind of, if you want to make things, I think it's okay for them to be really slipshod in the beginning and not in the right medium.
And truth is, that's really the only way to make things,
That's
because
the
if you
only way.
wait until it's perfect, you're just never going to start, right?
Yeah.
Like create. If you have something you want to create, now is the time to do it.
Yeah.
Um, I want to be honest on time. We've got about 5 minutes left, and there's a great question in the Q&A from Genevieve Quinton that says, so many popular self-help books rely on magical overthinking. There's a fine line between wanting to improve or better yourself and just thinking that people are just not thinking or trying enough positive thoughts to improve. And then like blaming people for not trying hard enough. Is that a source of magical thinking that you explored? Sort of, when does it dip into magical thinking? Because we all want to be better. We all
Yeah.
want to improve.
Totally. Yeah. I do address in some places throughout the book where self-help can get sinister. And yet at the very same time, there are some sort of nuggets of actionable wisdom in the book that were just like the tidbits of knowledge that I learned from the empirical studies that I was citing. Like, I didn't intend for them to feel self-helpy, but I couldn't not include the fact that like 80% of knitters in this one study, knitters with depression, said that after knitting, they became happier. I was like, oh my God, I gotta get into knitting, and it's not like that is not meant to be self-help. Like you need to knit if you have depression. But naturally it started making me think like, oh, what is something I can do with my hands? Because clearly there's something about doing something repeat with your hands that amounts to maybe a gift that you could give someone that you made. Like there's something in there. And so, yeah, I think like, of course, anyone who is not like perfectly content, and I don't know if I know anyone who's perfectly content, will want to, absorb wisdom from various places that they could maybe apply to their life. And I'm pretty skeptical of people who claim to have some kind of transcendent wisdom. I'm much more inspired by little fun facts from scientific studies that I can take or leave at my discretion.
I love that. And it reminds me, literally last week when I was working in the hospital, one of the patients that I saw was knitting. And that was how she was passing her time, because she had been there for a while. And it's not fun spending a lot of time in the hospital. And she had so many cool pieces that she had made. It's such an important component, this understanding of like skepticism, critical thinking. It's not about stripping the fun out of everything. It's not about being the stick in the mud. And it definitely does not mean that one is not still open-minded, right? I think that's sometimes one of my big struggles. And maybe the last question that I'll ask you is, when you take a skeptical perspective or you say, well, I saw this study and it actually says, like, sometimes I feel like the response to that is you're just not open-minded enough. And I
Oh,
struggle with that a little bit. So I'm curious if you've experienced that yourself.
yeah. Well, yeah, there are people, from time to time, yeah, maybe someone might perceive me as a party pooper or someone who's attempting to like over explain the punchline of a joke. It's like, just leave it, you know?
Because it's so
Um,
much funnier when you do that.
yeah, exactly. But the whole and I set this up in a part of the intro that I didn't read, but this whole book was an exercise for me in learning to live in the in between. Always in that swing, that seesaw between skepticism and imagination, truth and beauty. I don't think we have to choose or stake our claim on one perspective or another. I think it's good to be able to swing back and forth between the two and to know when it's appropriate and when it's not, and not to feel ideologically attached to skepticism versus the new age or whatever. Yeah, oddly and ironically, writing this book just made me want to be more mystical sometimes.
That's so interesting. Well, everybody, I want to thank you for joining us for this hour. The book is The Age of Magical Overthinking. Amanda, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to the audience and for the Toronto Public Library. I'm Cara Santamaria. Thank you.